Good morning. My name is Mikael Hilmersson. I currently serve as associate professor or docent at the School of Business, Economics and Law at University of Gothenburg. Prior to this, I was professor of international entrepreneurship at the Linnaeus University in Kalmar. I do research on small firms' internationalization. So I'm looking at the international expansion of the sales activities mainly, not really of purchasing activities and so forth, of smaller firms. And I've recently been doing quite a lot of research on the role of time, temporality, and speed of firm internationalization. I teach at the School of Business, Economics and Law at Gothenburg University in international business courses, and I'm responsible for the master program that we have in international business and trade. And I'm very happy to be here to try to summarize some of the most central aspects, learnings that we can have from research in international business with regard to international expansion of startup firms. I was invited to have this workshop or presentation since I'm also involved in this project as an ongoing evaluator or följeforskare, which means that I was planning and designing this survey that some of you answered. So I have some insights into what are the challenges that the firms in this community actually are experiencing. What type of firms are trying to expand internationally. So in this presentation, I have condensed the research or the research frontier that we have in this field around 4 questions that I will try to discuss and provide an answer for, which I find of relevance for you or for any firm that actually seeks to expand internationally. But before I start going into what research and theory says about international expansion, I would like to at least have a better idea than I have now about who you are and what the status of the firms that I'm talking to have. So if I ask how many of you are representing the startups here? Good. How many of you have any international sales now? Good, good. How many of you have sales in more than one market? More than one foreign market? Okay, good. Then I slightly better understanding of who I'm talking to. And do not hesitate interrupting. If you find that certain parts are more interesting than other parts of this presentation, I will have an agenda. Then we can direct focus to these aspects. Now this is some kind of covering these 4 questions that I want to raise or discuss of importance for understanding internationalization or international scaling. I refer to it as internationalization, but it's the same as international scaling then. First question, what does research say? What is required to succeed internationally? What kind of how far do you need to reach in order to be able to compete internationally? Second question concerns timing and time. When should you start internationalizing? What's the role of the time before you start going abroad and the speed at which you continue to expand internationally? Third question, market choice. Where should you seek to expand internationally? And the fourth question that I would like to address is how you should organize activities abroad, what research says about this issue. So these 4 questions I would try to discuss in a research perspective. And the background to this is that we know from research that firms that seek to enter foreign markets will face 2 liabilities or 2 challenges, 2 problems. The first one is the liability of foreignness. The liability of being a foreign firm when you enter a foreign market. So if a Swedish firm seeks to enter the French market, for example, you will face a liability of coming from Sweden, which generates additional costs. Legal regulation, it might be language, it might be distances and so forth. So compared to local competitors in that market, foreign firms will have additional costs. Still, we know that, the liability of network outsidership. We also know from research that firms that seek to establish activities in new markets abroad will have much weaker network contacts and fewer network relationships in that market as compared to local competitors. So first of all, you will have additional cost because of cultural differences, language differences, regulatory distances. And you will also have additional costs because you need to create and develop your own network. You don't have the same access to relevant network actors as local competitors, or in that example, French competitors would have. Even though firms are facing these two liabilities, we also see that foreign actors increasingly outcompete domestic firms in local markets. So what we know from research on this in this area is that firm-specific advantages can counterbalance the liability of foreigners and network outsidership. So even though foreign firms have additional costs, they are outcompeting local actors in foreign markets. And we also see that international competition in Sweden and in other local markets is increasing, meaning that today we cannot really talk about being active in the domestic market. Instead, you will face foreign competitors in Sweden. So I've myself done some research in this area and shown that it's actually in many cases more riskful to stay at home than it is to expand internationally. Yes.
Can you mention some of the firm's specific advantages?
I will go into that. I will go into
Thank you.
that will be my hopefully main point.
Okay.
So with this background, I would try then to seek an answer to the 4 questions that I mentioned. What is needed, required? What are the firm-specific advantages that you need in order to manage this liability of foreigners? Second, when should you start? And at what speed or how fast should you continue to expand internationally? Where should you seek to find growth opportunities? In which markets? How should you approach this market selection? And fourth, once you have chosen a market, how should you organize activities in that country? Or what are the options available and what are the pros and cons of these different options? So these are the 4 questions. And if then you find some of the questions more important to you, please let me know and then I will dedicate some more time for that. So my intention with this presentation is to show that first, internationalization should be seen as a risk-reducing strategy. If we look back in the literature and what we have seen in research, forming policy, what we have taught to students earlier has been that internationalization is problematic. You have liabilities, it concerns risks and so forth. What we see now in a globalized society is that in many cases it's probably more riskful to stay at home than it is to expand internationally. Because you cannot stay at home in Sweden, for example, and believe that you will not face international competition. So you would probably be outcompeted in Sweden by foreign companies coming to Sweden. So we see a very drastic reduced role of what we refer to as home markets in this globalizing society. I can share them, yes. My second point is that to succeed internationally, the firm's strategy need to build on capabilities that are valuable, rare, inimitatable, and non-substitutable. These are these firm-specific advantages that I mentioned. I will go deeper into this. That we see very clear from research that in order for a firm to be able to handle the foreign liability of being a foreign firm in a foreign market, you need to fulfill these criteria with the strategy that you develop. And I will go more into depth on that. Third, I would like to underline that internationalization should start early, but not be over-accelerated. Research is relatively clear that those firms that start expanding internationally at a young age will have a learning advantage of newness and create a global mindset at a very early day that will foster their continued growth. So what research shows is that the sooner you start expanding internationally, the better. But research also shows that there's a risk that you continue to expand internationally at a too high speed. If you enter too many markets at the same time, you will suffer from what we refer to as time compression diseconomies, that you will not be able to adapt your processes, your product services to that many markets at the same time. And I think that's also very clear connected to what Marianne said about these growth teams, that if you grow too fast, if you expand internationally too fast, it will be problematic, create problems. In the research world, we refer to that as time compression diseconomies, and I will come back to that. My fourth point is that the market selection process is central to the continued success of the firm. We know that internationalization of the firm is a path-dependent process, meaning that the first step you take, the first market you enter, will decide on where you will continue. So if you select the wrong market first, that will continue to generate problems. That we know quite clearly from research. So the selection process should be systematic, and it should be preceded by a relatively detailed analysis. Fifth, entering a foreign market is a trade-off between risk control and flexibility. So when deciding on how to set up the distribution model or the entry mode in the foreign market, you need to consider this trade-off between the risks control and flexibility.
So when you talk about market here, do you consider that national markets or sub-markets?
Valid point. In general, I talk about countries. But of course, I think that you would want from San Diego, right? I think that we couldn't talk about the US as one country. So it's a simplification from my point. But when I talk about markets or countries, markets, I normally mean countries. So that was my idea of introducing this problem area. Then I will have a few slides looking back to research on this, the traditional models that we have for understanding the challenges that a firm face when expanding abroad. And then I will return in light of this theory or this research findings to address the 4 questions that I introduced. So where did this field start? International business as a research field is a relatively young field. It started in the 1960s. Prior to that, we were doing a lot of research on trade between countries. But in the 1960s, we started to do research and try to understand internationalization from the firm perspective. Researchers, mainly in the US, were interested in understanding why do multinational firms exist? How can a firm outcompete local competitors in the foreign market? And as a Swedish researcher in this field, I'm quite proud that we had 2 researchers, Jan Johansson and Jan-Erik Wahlne, at that time at Uppsala University, who published a research paper which was entitled The Internationalization Process of the Firm in 1977. This paper is the ever most cited, referred to, publication in the top-ranked international business journal in the world. Which means that this paper has influenced how every researcher thinks about internationalization. It has formed and shaped policy around the world. I would say that no student who have studied a course in international business after 1977, they have all heard about this paper, and they have most probably read it. It has designed how Business Sweden has traditionally supported internationalization of firms. I guess it's the same in the other Nordic countries, because this has been an extremely influential paper. And it built on two questions. Jan-Erik Wahlne and Jan Johansson wanted to understand, why do firms choose to enter the markets that they do? And once they have chosen a market, why do they organize activities in a certain way in that country? They studied only 4 firms. They studied the international expansion of 4 firms. The history of Facit, typewriters, Sandvik Tools, Volvo, and Atlas Copco. So based on their study of these 4 firms, they created this paper which has influenced policy around the globe. And the paper is still the current best explanation that we have of firm internationalization. So how these firms behaved has not been really shown to be different in any other industries, the underlying mechanisms. So what did they observe? Regarding the first question, market choice. Why should you choose a certain market? They showed that these firms had started in Sweden, then they had entered Denmark, Germany, France, or relatively psychically close markets. So firms were not actually behaving in an economic rational way. The rational decision might have been to go to San Diego, enter the US market, a large market. But they started in psychically close market in Denmark or in Norway. And incrementally, these firms expanded away from the home market. That was the first observation that they made. Second observation related to the way firms organize activities in these markets was that they saw that the firms started with low commitment, low investments, starting by exporting from the home market. Then they started to collaborate with intermediaries, agents or distributors in the foreign market, later on setting up sales offices and perhaps local production units. So again, this incremental behavior. Perhaps it would have been economically more rational to start producing the products in the US from day one, but they didn't. Instead, they were growing relatively slowly in an incremental, stepwise way. So this is the empirical pattern or the observations they made by studying these 4 firms. And then we could see a pattern here that incrementally you invest more. These firms invested more in certain countries, and incrementally they expanded further and further away from the home market from a psychic perspective, meaning that they argued that the main hampering factor for internationalization is managerial uncertainty, meaning that you need that managers are making decisions under bounded rationality when you don't have access to the information that you have, that you could have. So instead of taking big risks, you are learning by doing, reducing uncertainties by generating experience. So generation of experience or experiential knowledge has been an extremely central way of explaining internationalization, meaning that uncertainty hinders firms from expanding internationally, so the key aspect is to generate experience and network contacts. So from research then, internationalization is seen as driven by experiential knowledge. It's with this experience you can generate, reduce uncertainty, and the obstacles of foreignness can be overcome. And the previous experience that the firm have been shown to decide the future path. So these are a summary, a simplification of these ideas, which have strongly then, as I said, influenced policy and the way in which we try to support firms historically in expanding abroad. Because we have some normative implications or managerial recommendations that come out of this research. And the first one is start building competitiveness in the home market. When resources have been developed, seek to exploit them internationally. When expanding internationally, start in psychic closed markets to generate experience. Continue the international growth relatively slowly and incrementally. These were the recommendations that we have in the 1977, which have formed and shaped how we view and talk about internationalization up until today, more or less. So traditionally, internationalization has been seen as a riskful strategy that should be undertaken incrementally to avoid risk and uncertainty. This is the traditional view. I talk about this incremental, stepwise process. Most of you have probably heard about Business Sweden's Steps to Export, for example, which is very much influenced by this research. But how about the firms that we see today? Skype, Spotify, Mojang. These are firms, they don't follow this incremental pattern. They are not building competitiveness in the home market to exploit it later on. Instead, they start on an international basis, more or less from day one, which means that we refer to them as born globals or international new ventures, which is very much challenging current state of knowledge in my profession or in research on this. So we can see that because of some developments in society that you know better than I do, working in this digital sector, but we have a lot of factors that have enabled born globals to exist. Today, you don't need to think about Sweden as your home market if you start up online, for example. So in research, we refer to born globals as firms that globalize rapidly without any preceding long-term internationalization period. Does this mean that the home market is no longer important? Johansson and Wahlne in 1977 said it was very important. Now we see firms such as Spotify, Mojang and others who considers the world as their home market, more or less. Is this decreasing the importance of experience? If we said that experience reduces uncertainty, enabling the firm to expand internationally? Does it reduce the liability of foreigners and the psychic distance that managers perceive? And most probably it's also decreasing the importance of national boundaries. These are questions that many researchers are trying to sort out today as a consequence of the occurrence of these born globals. And of course, these firms are also inspiring how we seek to develop policy and support for internationalizing firms today. Though some of you might know about Business Sweden's New Leap project, where they try to enable firms to become born globals. I think that this Health Tech Nordic is also very much inspired by this idea that we should try to support startups to go abroad early, which is very much in line with the research front in this area, that we say that the earlier the firm is able to start internationalizing, the higher the likeliness that you will benefit from what we then refer to this as learning advantages of newness. If you start designing the business model for an international market at a very young age, you will develop a global mindset and a business model which does not need to be adapted to the international market later on. So what we see today is that those firms that start in the home market, as suggested in the Johansson Wahlne's research from 1977, if you start in the home market, stay in the home market for 10, 15 years, develop your competences and so forth, those firms will have severe problems after these 10, 15 years when they seek to go abroad, because they have so established routines and processes and so forth, and it costs a lot of time, but also money, to change these business models later on. Therefore, this learning advantage of newness builds on the idea that if you start thinking internationally from day one, you will develop business models that can be implemented also internationally. And this has been shown quite clearly mainly in research from Finland on Finnish firms that developed these international business models from day one. So now I will return to these 4 questions when we have discussed and introduced the theory lying behind this and what we know. So first question then, what's the firm-specific advantage enabling the firm to overcome the liability of foreignness when expanding abroad? Then we will go to the other questions. So what is it that is required? What do we know from research that is required in order to develop what we refer to as sustainable competitive advantages in the international market? And then we know that the firm then will suffer from some kind of liability of foreignness. So if a Swedish firm, for example, should outcompete a French firm in the French market, you need to have some firm-specific advantages that supports this. And what we know from research is that these firm-specific advantages are dependent on the resource base of the firm. This means that when we try to understand why certain firms outcompete other firms, we have been introduced by an American professor named Jay Barney, and this is also an extremely influential paper, who have shown that the reason why Coca-Cola, for example, is earning a lot more money than Pepsi is that they have some firm-specific advantages related to the resource base. And the resources we classify as financial, human, and technological. And the main resource, of course, of Coca-Cola is that they have a highly valued, patented recipe. So how these resources are combined creates a capability, förmåga in Swedish. And if this capability generates some differentiated value or lower costs than the competition, then the firm will be successful. So this idea of the resource-based view on strategy builds on a few very important criteria here. First, a firm's competitiveness depends on its resources, human, financial, technological. A capability is the result of resource combinations, how you combine, you let the right people have access to the right funds and the right technology. That's the combination. And a capability becomes a competitive advantage as it's exploited by a single firm in the specific market. And most importantly, and this comes back to what is needed for these firm-specific advantages, a competitive advantage or a firm-specific advantage becomes a sustainable competitive advantage if it fulfills 4 criteria. It is valued in the market, the taste or the flavor of Coke, for example. It is rare in the market, you have a single firm. It's inimitatable, meaning that you cannot copy it easily. And it's non-substitutable. It cannot be replaced with another capability. And this is extremely clear in research. In order for a firm to develop a sustainable competitive advantage over time, the strategy needs to build on capabilities that are valuable, rare, inimitable, and non-substitutable. So if we visualize, SCA here is then sustainable competitive advantage. Capabilities that are valuable and rare will make the firm competitive at one certain point of time. But in order for that competitive advantage to be sustainable, that you will have a competitiveness over time, it needs to fulfill the non-substitutability and inimitatability criteria. Because if you only then fulfill the valuable and rare, someone else could copy it. To give an example, I have a friend when I was a student some years ago who wanted to start I normally talk to students about this, so they recognize it better than you perhaps, but he wanted to start a firm, and the firm was Pub Crawl Stockholm. The idea is then that he is organizing events for students and young people who pay some money, it's 200-300 kronas, to join this group of people going around to pubs where there are different discounts and so forth that he has negotiated. It's very popular, especially among exchange students. So exchange students at Swedish universities, they normally go once a semester visiting the capital of Sweden in Stockholm, and then they don't know which bars to go to and which pubs and so forth. So they join this, pay 200 Swedish kronas, go on this pub crawl, they meet new friends, they are invited to nice pubs and popular places and so forth. It's quite common among students at least. At this point of time, he asked me, do you want to join? I was living in Uppsala at that time. And do you want to invest some money in this idea? And then I said to him, I will not do that because you will not have a sustainable competitive advantage. You might earn some pocket money from this business idea. It's valued. It's relatively rare. No one else is offering it. But the idea is extremely easy to copy. So he cannot earn a lot of money on it. He could have his pocket money, some 5,000, 10,000 per month. But if it would become more popular than that, it would be extremely easy for someone else to start Pub Crawl Stockholm too. And if they would lower the price, of course, he would be outcompeted. So this idea fulfilled the valuable and rare criteria, but not the inimitatable criteria. He's still running it. He has financed a lot of vacations and so forth based on it, but he cannot live on it. I think it's a clear example of this. And this, of course, then if we say that when firms are entering foreign markets, you will face this liability of foreigners, these criteria becomes even more important because you will have additional costs compared to local competitors. So that was my answer to then from a research perspective, what is needed or required in order to become successful internationally.
So is Spotify then going to succeed in the long run because it's fairly easy to imitate and copy it? I mean, YouTube Music was launched yesterday, I believe, as an example.
It's a very good question. I know, but I don't own many stocks at all. But I think that one thing that I didn't mention now, which is relatively important in these new industries, which most of you are operating in, is that one very central and important capability or resource that we have seen in the literature in these type of industries is what we refer to as first mover advantages. So those firms that are first are often able to establish a mind in the place in the consumer's or customer's mind. They're often able to develop a very strong position in the business network, so that even though they don't have the strongest or best solution, they are competitive because they were the first. And I think that that's one of the aspects now that Spotify has established this position. They have a relatively large customer base, and for the customers there's some costs or problems involved in changing to a new operator. I just imagine those of you having an iPhone. Of course, there's quite a lot of investment from our side if you want to start using Samsung, because we need to learn a new phone. So being the first is often very important in this analysis, and I think that's the explanation why Spotify is still and probably will stay competitive. That would be my answer, at least. Okay. Then I will go to the second question, which is closest to my own research interest and my own passion, I would say, is timing and time and speed of internationalization. So trying to understand the role of time, temporality of speed, and speed of international expansion. Because from my perspective, I was quite intrigued by this idea of born global firms. I found it relatively naive that that born globals in all cases should be seen as role models. Because I found it relatively naive that a firm would manage to enter, let's say, 100 markets during the first year of its operation. How should you manage that? So I've been doing some research in trying to sort out the role of different speed aspects here. And we know from research that there's a strong relationship between timing, temporality, and speed of internationalization and the performance of the firm. So we know that when you start and how fast you expand will influence the performance, both in terms of market shares, but also in terms of profitability of the firm over time. And we know that firms that are able to start internationalizing or internationally at a young age will benefit from this learning advantage of newness, as I said before, that the earlier in the history or development of the firm internationalization starts, the more competitive the firm will become later on internationally. Because you design a business model which does not need to be adapted for the international market later on. Whereas we know that firms that accelerate the continued internationalization speed, meaning that if you would go to 100 countries during 1 year and try to establish a market position, they will suffer from what we refer to as time compression diseconomies. And this is related to the capacity or the capability of the mind of the managers. Normally when I talk to my students, I use an example when I say, imagine yourself preparing for an exam. And let's say that you all invest 7 hours preparing to this exam. I hope that they invest more time than that, but to be pedagogic in the example, you have 2 options. You could invest 1 hour per day during 7 days, or you can study 7 hours the last day. You would invest the same amount of time. But research is very clear that those that invest 1 hour during 7 days will outperform those studying for 7 hours the last day, because of time compression diseconomies. If you compress the time when you do something, you will not be able to process the information and digest the learnings. For the exam, in my situation or in your situation, when you expand internationally, if you meet too many new institutional regulative environments or different cultures during a compressed period of time, you will probably not be able to process the learnings experience that you have so that you can make the right decisions or adaptations. So it's the same mechanisms underlying here. So in my research then I tried to sort out this and separated the time that goes from when you start the firm to the first international sales from the continued international expansion, where the whole born global idea and this discussion has concerned this period. How long time does it take before you start internationalizing? Very little research has been done about the speed of internationalization, how fast you continue. And this is what I've had a 3-year project trying to sort out based on Swedish SME data. I've published 3 or 4 relatively high-ranked papers on these effects of timing on firm performance. And what we can see very clear here is that you have a positive relationship between speed to internationalization and firm performance. Firm performance both in terms of foreign market shares, foreign profitability, and the perception as well of the manager. Are they pleased with what they've done? We see clear signs that the shorter the time between inception of the firm and first foreign sales, the higher the performance. So those firms that manage to internationalize at a young age will increase the performance because of first mover advantages. If you're fast, you will be the first one establishing a position in that market. But also because of these learning advantages of newness. That you develop a global mindset from day one instead of considering yourself as being a Swedish firm that later on need to invest time and energy in adapting the business model for an international market. So that's the explanation. Second, if we think about this continued speed of internationalization after the first foreign market entry, how fast should you spread your activities? Here we can see what we refer to as an inverted U-shaped relationship. Some of you might be engineers, then you're a lot better than me in maths, but if I try to explain it in an easy way, this is in Swedish, avtagande marginalnytta, or decreasing return, that if you, at the first stage, expanding international to a certain speed, increasing the speed increases performance. But there's a point in this curve where it starts going down, meaning that you increase the speed too much. So instead of the performance going up, performance starts going down. And my explanation to this is that the first increase is because you have these first mover advantages in several markets. But if you seek to exploit your capabilities in too many markets at the same time, you will suffer from these time compression diseconomies. So this means then that you can expand internationally too fast, meaning that we should have a reflected view on this born global idea. Being a born global, starting in all countries in the world at day one is relatively naive. That would probably generate a lot of time compression diseconomies. So you need to balance the speed of internationalization. And what's interesting then with these inverted U-shaped relationships is that, okay, we can identify an optimal point. The point where the relationship between speed of internationalization and performance is at its best. Of course, that's very dependent on industries, it's dependent on the sample that you have studied and so forth. But I think that in my research, based on the data that I have, which is not digital health tech firms, but I think that the same underlying mechanisms are relevant. You need to process a lot of information. And it doesn't really matter if you are in a manufacturing industry or if you're in a digital health industry. I think that this point exists in all industries, but it might be on different positions. On my sample, the optimal point is entering one new country per year, on average. So what my data shows is that if firms are accelerating that speed, performance starts going down. And it's based on small firms, mainly in relatively traditional Swedish manufacturing industries. So it might be different in this digital health tech industry, but I think that the point exists, but it might be somewhere else. Probably if you're online, if you would develop an app and so forth, you would be able to enter more markets during the same time before profitability starts going down. I would be interested in doing that research, but what's important to keep in mind here that these time compression diseconomies are important for determining performance of the firm. So you would need to have a balanced way of approaching speed. Sorry, I was talking too long.
Well, so if I understand you correctly, you do the internationalization in a number of markets, and then you get a plus on the firm's performance. And then you continue the speed of internationalization too fast, so you get the time compression diseconomies on the subsequent markets you enter. So you make the wrong decisions on those markets because of the time compression?
At least that's how I would describe it.
Okay, just to understand.
Yeah. So if I return to this picture, the shorter the time between inception or start of the firm and its first foreign sales, the higher the performance. So entering or selling to a foreign market at a young age is good, because then you will have these learning advantages of newness, develop this global mindset. But after that, in my data, the optimum is entering one new country per year. In my data, if you're entering more than one country per year, performance starts going down.
And is that regardless of the size of the company? I mean, if you're 10,000 people or
Yeah. I see your point. In my data, I only have small firms. They are on average 50 employees. But I've seen the same. If there is research on multinational firms, which shows the same patterns. But of course, IKEA would be able to enter more than one country per year if they wanted.
Thank you.
Each time you start working on a new market, you sort of start climbing a new learning curve.
Yeah.
But obviously, second market you enter, moving through this learning process will take shorter time. And how does that affect this?
Now, my answer will have to be theoretical, because I cannot, based on the data I have access to, I cannot make that analysis. But there's quite a lot of research on these learning curves and the role of previous experience in enabling the firm to accumulate more experience. So we know quite clearly that the more international experience or experience in general the firm have, the easier you will learn later on. Which would then indicate that most probably you can accelerate the internationalization speed later on, because then you will not suffer from the same kind of time compression in these economies, because you have learned which questions to ask, what to take care of, how to adapt in foreign markets.
Is there any research on what sort of markets to enter into first and what to take on later on? Because there is a sort of process here, and different markets are more complex to enter and to learn.
There's quite a lot. Can I hold on that question? I will. It's very soon. I will come back to it, because there are some important findings on that market selection. Where should you start? And more importantly, I guess, what are the consequences of where you did start? I read the other day quite interesting research on the international foreign expansion of startups from China, where it showed that these firms, those that started in the Southeast Asian countries, they had a very slow internationalization speed, whereas those that started in Europe had a very high internationalization speed, which contradicted my impression. But I will return to that question, and please repeat it if I haven't answered it. Because that's related then to this, where should you expand internationally? Or the role of market selection in international expansion. And we know, this is of course, since it started already in 1977 with this paper by Jan Johansson and Jan-Erik Wahlne. One of the questions was market choice. Where did the firm start? And we know that the selection process is an important determinant of the international performance of the firm. Depending on where you start, you will have certain performance later on. We also know, and this is intriguing for me, teaching my students, doing research on this, that we know that the market selection process in many cases is far from systematic. It's rarely the outcome of a proper analysis. Instead, it's a result of unsolicited orders, meaning that a customer have seen your firm on the internet and they call you, could you start supplying us? And then you will direct all your energy to this customer and that market, and you will not have time to enter the market that you should have entered. It's based on improvisation and serendipities. During my doctoral research, I did interviews with 200 SMEs. And I would say out of these 200 firms, 5 had made a proper preparation for where they should start to internationalize. But I think that just being here, you are more engaged in these issues than most firms. But we know from research that very few managers have the competence, energy, and time to make this analysis in a proper way. Yes?
Because you think you make rational decisions, but you don't. You
No,
make
exactly.
irrational decisions. Always, more or less.
Yes, I think so, and it's two aspects in this, I would say. First of all, it's this unsolicited orders, serendipities, and so on. Should you say no because it's not the right first start? I would probably, if I would be struggling to sell my products, I wouldn't say no. So that's one part of it. The other part of it is that most managers are not acting on an economically rational logic. Instead, it's something else. And that was shown already in Johansson and Wahlen in 1977, that it was not economic rationality that guided these decisions. It was that you didn't want to enter markets that you found very uncertain. So they didn't want to invest without seeing the return on that investment. And I fully understand that way of reasoning. I think I understood it. I had been doing research in this field and studied it for 10 years before I understood the mechanisms in this model. And how I understood it was when me and my wife were buying our first house, because that was the first major investment I did. And it was connected to a lot of uncertainties. So then I understood this mechanism of not having the experience of owning a house. I didn't know which questions to ask, so I felt very uncertain, which meant that we made an incremental investment and we bought the lowest priced house we could find. I didn't dare to invest too much. I think it's the same, because we are talking about managerial decisions. We are humans. So it's the same mechanisms underlying this. And we know then that, unfortunately, there are very few managers that make this decision on economic rationality.
So what's the actual outcome? In terms of having, this is an awesome analysis with database and everything. It's really good. Let's go to this market. Or the more serendipitous one that, let's just go there.
It's a very good question. What I can say, what we know from research, is that we know clearly that this decision is, that internationalization is what we refer to as a path-dependent process. And path dependency, for those of you who are not familiar to it, means that the first step you take will direct where the second step goes. So we know that if this is consequences of unsolicited orders from, let's say, France, then the second step would probably be that that firm would start in selling to Switzerland or Spain after France. But it might have been much more potential if they would have started in the UK, and then this next step would be the US. So that's it. It's I think this is from case to case, and I understand that, of course, these serendipities are important. Unsolicited orders are important. I would probably not say no to it. But what I think is important is that you have an idea of how should we structure this analysis on which markets to enter. Because I think that I will refer soon to one of my favorite movies. If you have seen A Beautiful Mind, any one of you, John Nash, who won the Nobel Prize for game theory. There's a very interesting example that I would discuss later on the consequences of this. Is it out of battery? So this path dependency. So what we need to try to do is to be very systematic when evaluating markets. I had 5 startups, 3 from this community that were involved in a course that I had a few months ago at Gothenburg School of Economics and Commercial Law, where the students were writing international expansion plans for these 5 startups, trying to identify which markets were most attractive, where was the greatest potential. And they tried to systematize this by using different kind of segmentation criterias that were relevant for the specific firm. And what was very interesting was that I had 10 groups of students, 4 students, working with markets within Europe for 5 different startups. And I had 10 groups working with markets outside of Europe for the same 5, outside of the EU for the same 5 startups. So 20 groups. I think it was 8 of the intra-EU groups that landed in the UK or the Netherlands, potentially Germany. Outside Europe, 5 groups in Japan, 5 groups in the US. Even though they were working with different firms. But so it was quite clear that if they made this analysis, if they understood which market evaluation criteria that should be used, certain markets turned out as the ones with greatest potential. But then I would like to, as rational as these students could do as desktop research. Of course, they didn't know details about this industry and so forth. But I think they did it very well, and I know that most of the firms involved, of the startups, were very impressed by these reports. So I think that it was interesting to see.
Were these startups in the same area, or were they?
No, they were quite different. But since they were digital startups, most of them, of course, all of them, they include, okay, what's the spread of internet access as one variable. Many of them were working with elderly care, so okay, then the demographic figures were very important. But when they combined demographics with openness of the healthcare system with these different measures, they landed in more or less the same countries. But of course, we are all interested in San Diego. It's a beautiful city, and US is an attractive market. But I would like to reflect upon this with, then, as I said, one of my favorite movies. And what we will see now is the scene where John Nash presents his idea that he won the Nobel Prize for, this game theory idea. They are at a bar, and the blonde woman here should then represent the markets in this theoretical idea.
Mm-hmm.
Deep breaths. Can I ask? You might want to stop shuffling your papers for 5 seconds.
I'll not buy you gentlemen beer.
Oh, we're not here for beer, my friend.
Oh. Anyone else feels she should be moving in slow motion?
Will she want a large wedding, you think?
Should we say swords, gentlemen? Pistols at dawn?
Have you remembered nothing? Recall the lessons of Adam Smith, father of modern economics.
In competition, individual ambition serves the common good.
Exactly.
Every man for himself, gentlemen.
Yeah, those who strike out are stuck with their friends. I'm not going to strike out.
You can lead a blonde to water, but you can't make a drink.
I don't think he said that.
All right, nobody move. She's looking over him. Or she's looking at Nash.
Oh, God. All right, he may have the upper hand now, but wait until he opens his mouth. Remember the last time?
Oh, yes, that was the history books.
Adam Smith needs revision. What are you talking about?
go for the blonde. We block each other. Not a single one of us is going to get her. So then we go for her friends. But they will all give us the cold shoulder because nobody likes to be second choice. But what if no one goes for the blonde? We don't get in each other's way. And we don't insult the other girls. That's the only way we win. That's the only way we all get laid. Adam Smith said, the best result comes from everyone in the group doing what's best for himself, right? That's what he said, that's right? Incomplete. Incomplete. Okay? Because the best result would come from everyone in the group doing what's best for himself and the group.
Ash, this is some way for you to get the blonde on your own. You can go to hell. Governing dynamics, gentlemen. Governing dynamics. Adam Smith. What's wrong?
Yep, there we go.
Careful, careful.
Thank you.
So perhaps too much because I do research and I love this movie and I think this is a fantastic scene showing the role of John Nash's research that he won the Nobel Prize from. And I think that it serves quite an interesting input to how to reason on selecting markets as well. As I said, most of my students ended up with the suggestions. If you should enter a market outside of Europe, you should enter the US or you should enter Japan. Of course, every single startup in the world have the same idea. So everyone wants to be in the US. So the competition will of course be absolutely the toughest in these markets. So question is that a good start for a startup to meet the toughest competition in the world from day one? On the one hand side, it's important because you would test your strength, you would learn from this competition. But on the other hand side, if you don't fulfill these valuable, rare, inimitable, non-substitutable criteria better than the competitors in the US, you would fail. So my idea, and I think that we can see quite clearly that many firms are entering what has been referred to guerrilla wars instead. That you are not seeking to generate resources, grow your business in the toughest markets from day one. Instead, it might be more rational and you would be more competitive if you would look at other markets in the beginning. But that's a balance or a trade-off. Should you face the toughest competition from day one? Or should you generate your strength in other markets before you go into that market? And I think this illustration with this scene from A Beautiful Mind shows that quite well. So selecting markets is, I would say, should not only be made based on the market size or market attractiveness. It also should be based on what's your relative strength in that market. And of course, if you want to go to Silicon Valley or enter the US market, you will meet the toughest competition in the world from day one. So your relative strength might be weaker in that kind of environment. So if I would make this decision, I would also look at what are the strengths, network contacts, support that we could find in other markets. Could that counterbalance the fact that you're not entering the largest market? So that was my answer then to this, where or my ideas of how to approach this decision on where to set up foreign markets, foreign activities. So my fourth and last question was then how to expand internationally. How should you, once you have decided on which country to enter, how should you organize the activities in this market? And this is one of the most well-researched areas in my field. We refer to it as international distribution modes or international foreign market entry modes, which is at the core of the field of international business, since it's one of the major issues in dealing with the liability of foreigners. How should you organize your foreign activities to be able to compete in the foreign market? And in general, we separate in research hierarchical, intermediate, and export entry modes, which has different pros and cons for the firm when expanding abroad. Yes?
So if we form a team becoming one Nash, approaching Vlon, the US market, would we have, I mean, if we're like 5 startups approaching the same kind of customers, we would have capabilities that might outcompete the others.
Yes. I will have it in 3 slides or 2. But of course, that there are different ways of, because one of the, which I don't really think I have had time for this presentation, but one of the main challenges that I think that most of you are facing is what we refer to in the literature as the liability of smallness and liability of newness. You have fewer resources and less experience than many of your competitors. So how should you handle that? And my suggestion of what research says is very much in line with what Marianne says here, that it's by networking and cooperation. I don't know, some of you might remember the African saying that I had on my first slide. If you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go with others. And I think that's very much in line with that as well. If you want to go to foreign markets that are tough, it would be extremely hard to do it on your own. So, but let's return to this separation. And export modes, meaning that you externalize, you are not setting up foreign activities on your own. This means that you will have low control, low risk, high flexibility. Intermediate modes, licensing, franchising, strategic alliances, joint ventures, and so forth. You're sharing this with someone else. And then we refer to in the literature to hierarchical entry modes, where you internalize foreign activities. You have them within your own firm. I will come back to some of these ideas here. Yes, it's setting up a subsidiary, a daughter company in the foreign market. So if we start with the export modes, in the literature we're talking about many different forms that I just briefly will go through, but export buying agents, brokers, export houses, trading companies, and these are indirect, what we export modes, meaning that you have an indirect contact with the foreign market. And that's of course important, as I said, that experiential knowledge is one of the main drivers of internationalization that enables firms to expand internationally. So if you would start with an indirect export mode, you would also have an indirect contact with the foreign market, meaning that you wouldn't generate much experience. You would be extremely dependent on this actor. And that actor earns their money based on the information they have about the customer. So they will not share it with you. So you would be in a catch-22 where you don't really generate experience. Then we have direct export modes where you instead then have a direct contact with the foreign customer or with an intermediary agent distributor on foreign soil. So then you're starting to meet these cultural differences, institutional differences on your own, meaning that you will face uncertainties, problems, but you would also generate experience for the future. And then we come to this, close to this idea that Marianne said here. What we see is that many small firms, startups, suffer from this liability of smallness and liability of newness, meaning that they don't have resources enough to enter high competitive, far distant markets. What I studied early in my doctoral research was, then I was at Linnaeus University in Kalmar. Then I studied a very, very successful export network. It was called Sustainable Sweden Southeast AB. And this was in 2003, 2004, 2005. I don't remember exactly, but it was when the European Union was enlarged, when the Baltic states became members, when Poland became a member of the European Union. Then there were a lot of infrastructural investments in the former Eastern European countries for wastewater treatment and for different kind of these water systems. So a group of firms in southeast Sweden, in Kalmar, Öland, Karlskrona area, joined forces and started this export network, Sustainable Sweden Southeast. The firms were all relatively small, relatively resource poor firms with very niche-oriented competences, most of them related to energy and wastewater. So what they did was that they set up a joint sales network with an office in Poland. They employed 1 or 2 persons that were working as the sales manager for all firms in this network. And they became extremely successful and won a lot of tenders for different wastewater treatment systems in Eastern Europe that none of these firms would have been able to do themselves. For example, they were together with Skanska, they were building the 2 new really large investments in wastewater treatment systems in St. Petersburg, which was also related to the EU because it was on the European border more or less. So EU was involved in that. They were involved in investments in a number of hospitals in Poland. So they were extremely successful action network where they joined forces. None of them could have had the resources themselves to employ sales managers for these markets. None of them had time and energy to follow these, understand the EU tendering systems and so forth. So they instead joined forces, employed 1 or 2 persons responsible for this. And it became extremely successful. A very interesting case on how small firms can compensate for their individual shortcomings or the liability of being small, liability of being inexperienced. And if I would change my hat from being a researcher to my role as this ongoing evaluator of Följeforskare of this Healthtech Nordic project, I think that this would be extremely interesting to see some kind of initiatives where you could join forces to be able to compete in the tougher markets, just like Marianne said. I think this is a very interesting role model for that kind of initiatives. Okay, I move on to these intermediate entry modes. I will go through them relatively quickly because you know them, I think, as consumers. I don't really think that they are on top of your agendas in an early stage, but we're talking about mainly licensing and franchising, joint ventures, strategic alliances. Joint ventures might be of relevance. Strategic alliances, or the difference, if you want to learn some theory, the difference is that with a joint venture you need to form a new firm, just like Sony and Ericsson did back in the days. In a strategic alliance, on the other hand, you don't form a new firm. Instead, you sign contracts on how to collaborate. The example I use for my students is often this long-going cooperation between McDonald's, Disney, and Coke, where they are marketing their different products in the different arenas where they operate and so forth. And then we find hierarchical entry modes, which then means setting up a daughter company, a subsidiary, which might be for foreign sales, but also for foreign sales and perhaps production if in those industries where that's relevant. So having that said, we mainly separate between externalization, meaning export modes, from internalization modes. And this, how to select this, the decision, we have quite a lot of research on what are the pros and cons. And this slide, I will not go into details on all of it. Of course, you have access to it later on. But what we know from research is that depending on certain aspects of the firm and of the market, it's better to make certain decisions when setting up foreign operations. And here I will look at what increases the performance when you internalize activities. When should you set up a foreign sales office? When should you have your own subsidiary abroad? That will be represented by the green boxes, whereas the ones where you should not set up a subsidiary, instead you should collaborate with an intermediary agent distributor. That's the red ones, according to research in this field. So, if we look at the firm characteristics, we know quite well that if firms are big, it's better to set up own subsidiaries abroad. If you have a lot of international experience, it's better to set up foreign subsidiaries than collaborating with intermediaries. If the product is very complex, if you have a technically complex product, it will be very hard for an intermediary, a distributor, an agent to actually present it to the customers and explain how it works. So if the product is, the more complex the product, the higher the better you will perform if you set up your own subsidiary. If the competitive advantage of the firms builds on a differentiation advantage instead of a cost advantage, meaning that you're producing Heston's beds instead of IKEA's beds, then it will also be hard to transfer it to an intermediary, so it's better to set up your own subsidiary. Then, if you want to have control of the activities, then you should internalize or set up your own subsidiary. These are very theoretical, so I will skip them now. If there are a lot of trade barriers, if it's hard to export, then of course it's better to set up a foreign subsidiary and produce the product in the foreign market. There are few intermediaries available, and if the market size is large, if you're entering a large size market, it's better to set up a subsidiary than it is to collaborate with an intermediary or an agent. Then the red boxes then represent when you should collaborate with an intermediary, an agent or a distributor instead. Then research is quite clear on the fact that if you're risk averse, if you want to avoid taking big risks, of course it's easier to sign a contract that you will collaborate with an agent or a distributor instead of investing in your own facilities. If you want to be flexible, if there is a very intense competition where you don't really know if you will have these firm-specific advantages or not, you should perhaps prolong the decision to set up a subsidiary. We also know that in socio-culturally distant markets or culturally distant markets, it's better to collaborate with intermediaries than setting up your own activities. Very common. I did in my doctoral thesis study Swedish small firms' entries into Russia and China. And I would say that 95% of Swedish small firms entering Russia and China, they are doing it via agents. Because these agents are the translators, both when it comes to language, but also when it comes to culture and so forth within these markets. Same goes then with risks. So, quite big framework, but different aspects, very well researched in the international business literature that you need to take into account when deciding on which mode of entry is better than the other when you have decided which market to enter. Now I only have one part left before we can start discussion based on what you find more interesting than others. But the last is then recommendations. Based on what I've said now, based on what we know from research in this field, what kind of recommendations could I give from this theoretical researcher's perspective? So I said here some key points from a crash course in international business. You have now followed what I do in 5 weeks at Gothenburg University, so I apologize if I've been quite quick. First, internationalization has traditionally been seen as a riskful strategy. What we see now, I see it in my own research, I serve as senior editor for a journal called Journal of International Marketing, which is one of the leading American journals in this field. There comes a lot of research showing the fact that internationalization should not be seen as an event of risk-taking. It's more riskful to stay at home. Because of globalization, you will not be able to avoid foreign competition in Sweden or in Denmark or in Norway. So it's better to start preparing yourself and expand internationally. I did research on small firms in the wake of the recession that we had in 2008-2009. And what I very clearly could see was that those firms that were, the more internationally active they were, the better they performed during the recession. I titled that paper, "Spread Your Eggs and Do It Quickly," meaning that you should spread the risks. Just when we talk about stocks and investments, you're always balancing your risks in your portfolio. The same is evident in the internationalization aspect, that firms that are internationally active in different markets are balancing the risks and will have better performance under such circumstances. My second point, to succeed internationally in developing a sustainable competitive advantage, the firm strategy needs to build on capabilities that are valuable, rare, inimitable, and non-substitutable. So I would argue that you should sit down and reflect upon what is it that really will create your competitive advantage. And figure out, is that inimitable? Because I wouldn't invest too much money if it was very easy to imitate. Just with this pub crawl example. My third point, the earlier the internationalization start, the better. Start early. The fact that you're sitting here is that you're starting to prepare yourself, which is very good, because research is clear that those firms that start early, develop a global mindset, will have the opportunity to draw on learning advantages of newness. But then keep in mind that you might expand too quickly afterwards. So try to balance this continued internationalization speed so that you don't overheat the organization. Fourth, the market selection process is strongly affecting the international performance of the firm and should be given time and energy. And you should be aware of the consequences of starting in a certain market. Of course, it's extremely attractive to start in the US, but that's also the toughest environment. Maybe you should start somewhere else first to generate your experience, develop your experiences, generate capital and so forth before you face the toughest competition in the world. On the other hand side, if you believe that you have capabilities that are valuable, rare, inimitable, and non-substitutable in a global comparison, of course, then you should be in the US from day one to generate these first mover advantages. But if you're uncertain, I wouldn't start in the US. Fifth, entering a foreign market is a trade-off between risks, control, and flexibility. And depending on the context that you're entering, different modes of distribution or modes of entry are giving different benefits. And then I would like to end by returning to this African proverb, which I find very guiding when looking at what we say in research now from a small firm perspective. If you want to go fast, go alone, but if you want to go far, you should go with others and try to join forces to compensate for this liability of smallness and liability of newness. Thank you. Any questions would be welcome.
You had the slide with human resource, technology resource,
Yeah.
and financial. So, if you have really good financials, that's the one, yeah? You have really good financials, you have excellent technology, but you have an organization of people who sucks. You won't succeed, right?
Yep.
If you have really good people, no money, great technology, you will not succeed.
Yep.
But I mean, the key thing there, wouldn't it be the human component? I mean, it's not alone guiding, but if you don't have that, will you succeed if you have good financials?
I think
Do you see what I mean?
probably if I would reread this research by A. Barney, I would have a perfect answer to what you say. But of course, since the idea is that the way in which capital, technology, and humans are combined determines the capability and advantages of the firm. Of course, it's the human that combines it. It's some human who decides that now we should combine it in this way. So of course, without that manager's competences, you will not succeed. So I think that the human resources in that sense would be the most important. Yes. Since that's where the decision on how to combine the resources is taken.
A different question. In your work, did you make a reflection on speed of internationalization and the dependency on physical presence, meaning a sales office or a manufacturing plant versus a cloud-based service? And how did that impact speed and liability?
I think it's a very relevant question. What I can answer from based on my research and the results, then I could give a more theoretical answer. But first, now I made a simplified presentation on the speed that I've studied by looking at the number of markets. What I also did in that paper which this builds on is that I looked at what's the role of the speed at which you are investing abroad, which is where I could see that if I said that speed has this inverted U-shaped relationship on performance, that had a U-shaped relationship on performance, meaning that those firms that invest abroad directly will have a higher performance than those that invest at home to invest later abroad. Meaning that, and to me the explanation is that of course if you decide to invest in Sweden first and then move that investment abroad, then you will have two investments and you cannot really have return on both. But I don't really know if that answers the question. I think that you are welcome to repeat the question if you didn't have answer.
Spotify versus Koenigsegg.
Yeah.
I think there are limitations in how fast Koenigsegg could actually penetrate the market.
Yeah.
Because of physical presence,
I fully agree. I think that it would be a problem if I would have in my research included Spotify and Koenigsegg in the same analysis, because then it wouldn't be the speed, it would be something different, which would determine performance. My data here was on relatively traditional manufacturing, Swedish tool industry, machine producers and so forth. In that sample, there are no industry effect. I controlled for different industries. I think that if I would have made the same analysis based on you guys or these digital health companies, the optimal performance level would have been somewhere else. It would not be entering one new market per year. But I still think that there would be this inverted U-shaped relationship that you can expand at a too high speed. But the point would move probably that you would be able to enter more markets in this industry during the same period of time because of online access to customers and so forth. So there are industrial differences, but I think that the pattern or the relationship between speed and performance is the same. That it goes up and then it goes down. But where it starts going down is moving between industries.
Just to relate to the e-health that you mentioned, I mean, are there any analysis showing that maybe the markets are not defined by nations, but rather by language and so, or even, I mean, if you look at Spotify or that you know, they don't really care where you market its music. If you look at some of the AI apps, for example, it's mostly social media, and it's really not US or China. It's how you access the app, and that's language rather. So it's completely different.
I don't think that, at least I haven't seen, and I've tried to find that kind of research on this industry or this business type. But what I can say is that the research world is moving quite a lot from focusing on cultural differences between countries to looking more at networks spanning different countries. Where I think that we are quite convinced, and I didn't mention it, I hope, during today's presentation, that culture is of reduced importance. I think that in your industry, you have a common culture so that you are talking more or less the same language as your customers in the US or in the UK or in the Netherlands. I see the same in universities. We have this industry culture. So in a university, there's no cultural difference between being at the university in Sweden, Germany, France, or the US. We are at universities, we have the same culture with small differences. But there's a bigger culture. The same goes, I think, that between cities. I live in Gothenburg. I think that Gothenburg and then Marseille, or a city of the same size in France or Germany, is relatively similar, whereas there's a greater difference between rural and urban areas today. So we are, in the field of international business, reducing our, we are not believing anymore that culture is that important, because we think that cultures are harmonizing.
Rather a comment to the same question. I've just been involved in a virtual reality project related to basically introducing technology as a means of educating people about healthcare. And the reason this is used is that there's a group, an underserved population in the US that is not taking advantage of healthcare because of cultural differences. So the virtual reality tool has been adopted to their culture to be able to bridge that problem. So that is the core problem in that project. From that in that context, culture is completely culture/religion.
Of course, I might simplify. Of course, it's important. I think my answer is mainly related to what determines the way in which firms expand internationally. And traditionally, we have seen that culture is one of the most important aspects deciding which markets firms are entering, which problems that they face. But nowadays, we don't believe that anymore, that culture is the most important determining internationalization. So I was planning to have it as part of today, but I didn't. We have traditionally seen this liability of foreignness as the one and only problem. Whereas nowadays we are talking about liability of network outsidership as important. That if you don't have access to the right people and right persons, that's more of a problem than the fact that you speak a different language. So we are moving towards a network view rather than a country-based view on society. Okay.
Yes. So how did we go about this concretely? Could we use your students? Could we use you? To make our decisions individually. I've got this kind of product, I've got this kind of advantage, I've got this control freak inside, I've got this flexibility desire, etc. What do I pick? What kind of...
I would be very interested. As I said, I had a course in March, April now, which is a course in international business for the business strategy students at School of Business in Gothenburg, where this was a 5 weeks course condensed into talking about time compression, diseconomies. But in that course, this spring, I had 5 startups participating, where they were coming and introducing themselves, their activities, and then the students were assigned to write international expansion plans for these 5 firms. I would welcome any one of you to be such a case, because I think that it's very beneficial for my students to work with real live cases instead of scrolling on the internet and write about H&M's international activities, because they don't learn very much. They were very pleased, these students. I think that most of the startup representatives were pleased. Of course, some of the thoughts from the students are relatively naive, since they are doing desktop research. They don't really know the industry that good, but they are putting, they are integrating some research academic perspective into these decisions to make it in a structured way. Of course, you could fill them yourself with more detailed data on the industry and so forth, but the way of approaching the problem becomes more systematic. Then I also am responsible for all master theses that are written at our university in the field of international business. There, of course, there are a lot of opportunities, students that want cases to write about and to do their research about, where I gladly would welcome or invite, if you have ideas, thoughts that you wanted someone to work with, I would be open to.
No, I'm just thinking, is it possible to find like the least common denominators for all the Baltic Nordic companies and do it for Baltic Nordic projects somehow?
I
The
wish.
way that sustainable Sweden and blah blah blah. what
Yeah, exactly.
They were called it.
Polish
No, the
copy.
same way. Or sim-
I think I'm the researcher, and I talk in theoretical terms. You're the doers and practitioners. You know that much better than I do. But I think that from my perspective, it would be an extremely valuable initiative that I think would be beneficial for all of these companies. I mean, in line with this segmentation of the community and so forth, you could have different responsibilities for the different segments. I think that it would be
Maybe
very
we need to be
valuable.
systematic as well when we select markets.
Yeah.
We are going to. Yes.
No, I think it would be a very good and natural next step. Now you have this community, the knowledge share, the information sharing, the learnings taking place. Next step would be actually exploiting this by setting up some kind of joint collaboration to support action, not just learning.
So there are some immediate opportunities when it comes to distributing together with Cerner, the EMR system that Region Skåne just bought, and they have an open, an open platform infrastructure with open APIs, and they want to cooperate with the startups in health technology to be able to globally present solutions for mental health, all through from the individual to, or the chronically diseased, multi-chronics, etc. Tools for doctors, tools for elderly care providers, etc. But we're just about to negotiate that with them, how that could be beneficial for you guys. It's very easy for you to go on top of their open APIs right now, but if they market groups of companies into solving, different aspects of healthcare, that could be beneficial. Another opportunity that might rise is that certain companies have engaged in certain global companies right now, and might be helpful in using the global medtech provider or whoever. I can't talk much about that now. That jointly could distribute. Yeah. But that's a decision that you have to take after that you've considered the route and the market decision, the market and the route to the market. So it's two different things, isn't it?
On the one hand, yes, but if you remember when I had this slide on what research says should guide the market selection decision. On the one hand side, 95% of you would say that US is the most attractive market because it's big, it's advanced, blah, 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 blah. On the other hand side, you might not have the relative strength needed to compete in that market. So I would say that if the Health Tech Nordic startups would join forces and decide, okay, now we should take the UK, and but many of you would focus on that. Of course, the relative strength in that market would be very, 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 very strong, and you would be able to compensate for potential liabilities of newness or smallness in that market because you collaborate. It could be in the US as well, but I think that if you join forces, it might be that you decide, okay, this market is more interesting than the other market, so let's go there because together we have a strong relative strength.
But in this case, it makes sense to group companies that have synergies just looking at their business themselves. Like, for example, let's take mental health, a company here in the region, Flow Neuroscience. And us, we are active in the fertility space. We're helping fertility clinics to have more efficient treatment outcomes. There is no overlap.
No, exactly. And
well, actually, there could be. If you're looking at primary care is increasing in cost in most parts of the world. And if you're not focusing on increasing consumption, which insurance companies are not, and governments in the Nordics are not focusing on increasing healthcare consumption, the primary care interface to individuals could be fertility, could be sneezing, could be arthritis, could be continuous monitoring of your heart, could be all kinds of things. So the primary care could be an actor interested in a bundle of opportunities.
I think one point that comes up with a couple of startups is also private sector versus public sector, whereas the public sector is a pain in the neck. Because very big, very slow moving, and I think I see this in the UK with the NHS. A lot of startups want to reach out to the NHS, and each startup is approaching the NHS individually, and that's just super weak. So if you can team up and speak with healthcare systems, insurance companies, etc., in a group, for example, in terms of primary care. Yeah, that would make sense.
And I think that's very much now. I wish I would have had more time because then I would have talked more about this network aspect. Because what we say now is very much related to this liability of network outsidership. And I think that most of you suffer from that in relation to foreign markets. And we are talking in research then about who is the door opener for you to the customer. And of course, if you come on individual basis, it's hard to have someone opening the door for you. But if you come with this network as Sustainable Sweden Southeast did, or if you come as this community, of course, many more doors will be opened. So I think that joining forces will make your voices stronger or heard, and it will also enable someone to open the door. It will not be beneficial for all of the community members, but in different cases, you will attract different interests, I think. Because that's what happened. Of course, all these partners of this Sustainable Southeast Sweden AB, all of them didn't get huge deals, but some of them did at least. And none of them would have if they wouldn't have joined forces.
Yeah, and you mentioned Japan before, and it got me thinking as well, actually. Japan is aging population, tech-savvy, high internet access. Language barriers, culture barriers, sure, but we know one dementia company here in the region is making inroads there, and maybe we could tag along to that, I would say. Could I make another reflection, actually, just
sure.
Like a comment, because you had the slide where you actually make the decision on which market to go to. Can't remember exactly the one. You had a serendipity and all that stuff there.
Should be somewhere here. Say stop.
Yeah, that's right. So this is just a reflection or comment, but because I recently listened to Surrounded by Idiots, Omgiven av idioter, which then characterizes 4 different people: red, blue, green, and yellow. And in many cases, it's the red person who leads the company as an entrepreneur with all the energy and all that stuff. But less focus on details, less focus on data, which the blue person had. And you mentioned in your case that you had a number of companies that made a selection on proper data, and there's just 5 companies, I think.
Yeah.
So I just say it could be worthwhile just be aware of who you are, who you have in your team, because that's going to influence your decision at the end of the day in a major way, I think. So just a comment.
I'm sitting right now trying to have a paper published which addressed this, trying to understand where I see serendipitous opportunities or serendipity as something positive. Because we see that those firms that actually act on serendipity, they grow very fast and they generate higher value than those acting on less serendipitous opportunities. So I'm trying to publish a paper where I show what kind of, what I refer to entrepreneurial logic, what will it lead to if you are very systematic, if you're well planned, as compared to if you improvise and you have a lot of autonomy in the firm. And it's very clear, in my data it's very clear that if you plan, if you're acting very systematic, you will find what you have already done before, meaning that you don't generate much value, you don't grow fast, but you grow in a stable way. Whereas if you're improvising, if you have more autonomy in the firm, you will identify serendipitous opportunities which are riskful, but at the same time have a higher growth potential. So I'm trying to sort out this. So serendipities in my world is not necessarily a problem. It might be beneficial, but it's also riskful because you cannot build on your previous experience when acting on serendipities.
As a continuation of that, wouldn't working the traditional way with the plan, sometime maybe you keep going by the plan even though it's not really working with the reality that you encounter?
Yeah, this is I don't dare to say too much about it as a researcher because we don't really know that's very at the frontier of research now. But we have if you want to bet your money for a future Nobel Prize taker, I would say that it would be a woman called Sara Saraswati, an Indian entrepreneurship researcher, who is talking about this role of planning and so forth for innovation and growth. I wish she was. Then I would have been proud to be a colleague. No, she's at MIT in the US. She's really a world star. You can go in and see her TED Talks. Fantastically inspiring, Sara Saraswati. But her main idea is that she has studied serial entrepreneurs in the US. And she has shown that those that are most successful as serial entrepreneurs are not systematic, are not planning. They don't set up the target and then generate the resources needed to reach that target. Instead, they follow what she referred to as an effectuation logic, meaning that they look in the hands, what do I have and what can I do with these resources? And then they create a network to exploit these resources. Her example is that if you should make, she calls it a curry in a hurry, since she's from India. If you should cook and you don't really have time, you have two strategies. Either you open cookbook to find a recipe, and then you go to the supermarket and buy the ingredients. That's the planning way. Whereas she shows that the more successful entrepreneurs, they open their fridge and see what can I do of the raw material that I have. And that's really where we are now. We're trying to understand, is it good to plan? Because if the plan is not really the right one or the best fitted plan, optimal plan, then of course you will keep running in the wrong direction all the time.
Also because, like you mentioned yourself, we are now at a time when the way companies work, what their products are, it's just not industry anymore.
Yeah, exactly. And we also know that the business environment is changing much faster today than it did before, meaning that plans are less relevant today.
And also what you mentioned about cultures, I wouldn't agree with what you said about culture not being important, but I would say that we define cultures as something different.
Yeah.
I mean, a culture of IT people.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
But it's still there,
yeah.
And it's still about how we communicate and how we understand each other.
And I think that's my main
geography.
The greatest cultural differences are not necessarily related to nations or countries. It might be between professions instead.
Because you already work in Africa.
Yeah, but
so
the market that has not been interesting to anyone else.
Well, it is. They will run faster. They don't have the problems we do with the public healthcare system. So you could be an entrance point. You know a lot about the African market. You've got certain markets, you've got customers already. So anyone who wants to go to Africa, join you.
Talk to and who is the company going to Africa? Already in Africa?
We are Medcard apps, e-health, digital patient records, which is really, you could say that our USP is sort of that we're low tech and high tech, because it's not internet based necessarily. A lot of the specific challenges of the African market is to be IT but low tech. Works with existing hardware, which is often quite old, and if Swedish doctors don't want to work on the computers, well, African doctors are even less inclined. So, and actually people are bloody dying because paper records are lost. So it's high tech and low tech. So I feel a bit of like the weird product in the room, but and also I guess we're a bit special in the sense that what was the expression? born global for the firm. I mean, we're Swedish based, but Uganda is our first market. So we haven't had a sale in Sweden, and we never will. So.
But Mikael, you mentioned early on that the old Business Sweden program, Steps to Export, were following the research from 1977, which is kind of outdated. And then you mentioned the LEAP program that Business Sweden is doing. Is that a successful way of trying to figure out which market to enter first? I mean the LEAP program?
I think so. I haven't seen the since it's starting up more or less now. I've only seen
I think they've run 4 or 5 programs.
Yeah, okay. What I know, I met one of the consultants running that program, and when he presented it, I found it much more in line with current research than I found the Steps to Export, at least. So I think that it's a good initiative from Business Sweden. I think all these kind of programs are good, but I think that they can be better than others, and I think that this LEAP program is a clear improvement, much more in line with the research frontier in the field than the Steps to Export programs.
Health Tech Nordic is talking to Business Sweden of setting up a LEAP Health Tech pilot early autumn. So far we are struggling with the Utrikesdepartementet. I don't know what you call that in English.
Foreign department.
Foreign, yeah. To figure out how to handle the non-Swedish participants. But we will get there. So hopefully there will be an alternative from LEAP Health Tech presented early autumn. So keep an eye open for that.
Otherwise,
did you have a question?
We'd like to raise the question of financing. If you look at Southern California, for example, you'll find a sort of much more aggressive financial culture than we have here, at least. And there are many examples of similar companies you'll find there and here. And those in that part of the world, they move on much faster. How does this affect export and internationalization strategies?
I would say I think that there are other people in the room knowing more about these different venture capitalists and so forth and the role of them. I will therefore only answer to the second part of your question, how this aspect might influence internationalization. And I would say that my impression and view is that for Nordic health tech companies, internationalization is a must at a young age. Our home markets, if we consider them as home markets, are very small. So firms in these markets are forced abroad if you really want to become a real firm and not just staying as a startup. Whereas in the US, you have a very large home market. So we know from research that American firms are less, they are not seeing internationalization as a natural ingredient in the early days of their activities, which means that we can see that Swedish and Nordic firms are relatively competitive internationally because they have this learning advantage of newness, that they were forced abroad at a young age, developed an internationally strong business model. Whereas American firms, they stay in the home market quite late, as Johan Sonnenwall predicted, and then they start expanding. And they are not really experienced of the international market. So we are often more competitive internationally than the American firms, if the firms are at the same size. The problem is that the American firms can grow quite big before they need to go abroad. but you might know better from some
No, but if I understand you right, you say that American companies in many cases have an advantage as they already are in a much larger market, but they also have access to a sort of different financial structure. And the meaning of this is that say that the Swedish or Nordic companies not only need to internationalize fast, but they also need to base their financing on international markets.
Yeah. And the latter, I think, I can agree with confidence. And we also know, I was planning to add that, we also know that the home market of the firm is a very important predictor of the international competitiveness of the firm. We know that there's a reason why windmill production from Denmark is globally competitive. Because you have all the requirements to become competitive in that industry. And one of the aspects in that is that the competitive environment in the home market is a very important determinant of whether the firm will be internationally competitive. And of course, if you start up in Silicon Valley, where the competition is the highest in the world, if you manage to get out of Silicon Valley, you are competitively relatively strong. So American firms are, thanks to the competitive environment in the home market, they become competitive abroad as well.
So, it's kind of where I started my question about the markets, right? Because so what we're talking about here is leverage, and risk leverage is, you know, a way of life and business in the U.S. that is becoming more. I mean, it's becoming more aggressive in the Nordics as well, and U.S. companies are actually moving over here to grab technology. But I think the trick is to find the sub-market. I mean, the U.S. needs to be looked at as multiple markets, and you find your sub-market where you are relatively protected from competition, but you're able to leverage skills, technology, networks. I think that you know, so you get a little bit more granular in the market analysis, where you can survive, where you're more protected, where you can take advantage of these opportunities, and that may be, it's true for Europe as well.
I fully agree, and I think that, to me, theoretically, I would explain it with this valid or varying, imitatable, no substitute. Unless those criteria are fulfilled in a, let's say, global analysis, then you should not enter the toughest markets. Then you should find somewhere below the radar to develop your competencies, build your resource base. Okay. And I think that I don't know the schedule. Marianne will do this, but I don't think that we need to sit down unless there are more questions. My legs are tired. I would like to sit down.
This dialogue. We need to address these issues in a way that is helpful for you. Okay? No answers yet, but please let's continue talking. Okay? And leave might be an option. Cerner, others. All kinds of opportunities coming up. But if you need it now, let's see how we can find someone who could guide you. Okay? Thank you. Thank you so much, Michael.
Thank you.